World Geography, Unit 4, Cultural Geography, Video 4.1. This video focuses on introducing you to the concept of culture. We can talk about what culture is, but it's really difficult to define culture. Geographers define culture as the body of material traits, customary beliefs, and social forms that together constitute the distinct tradition of a group of people. Culture follows logically from the last two lessons that we've looked at, which is population geography and economic geography. Geographers focus specifically on two aspects of what we call material culture. Material culture is those things that derive from daily life or necessity, and culture involving leisure activities. Every culture has a hearth. A hearth is where something originates. So for example, baseball originated in the United States, and so that the cultural hearth of baseball, the culture of baseball, originated in the United States. From there, every culture diffuses to a certain extent. That's the process of a characteristic spreading. Baseball has diffused throughout the entire world. So if we look at culture, there are different aspects of culture. Daily necessities, these both make up material culture. Daily necessities, material culture, that's when we look at things in daily life like food, clothing, and shelter. So for example, the daily necessities are the same whether you live in Iceland or where you live in Japan. However, each culture accomplishes those things differently. Houses look different, insides of homes look different, decorations look different, food is different, etc. All people must consume food, wear clothing, and build shelter, but different cultural groups do so in distinctive ways. Another part of culture is leisure activities. Leisure activities focuses on, of course, arts and recreation. So Spanish tradition of bullfighting is prevalent in Spain, obviously, whereas NASCAR, watching cars race around a track, is pretty specific to American culture. Geographies study the relationship between material culture and the physical environment. Each cultural group takes particular elements from the environment into its culture and in turn constructs landscapes that modify nature in distinctive ways. So in Iceland, they take what they have in the landscape and modify it distinctive ways to accommodate their material culture. Same with the Japanese. In looking at cultures, we have to make a distinction between habit and custom. Habit is a repetitive action that a particular individual performs. For example, you have a habit of eating ice cream after dinner, whereas a custom applies to an entire culture. A custom is a repetitive act by an entire group. So unlike custom, habit does not imply the act has been adopted by most of society's population. A custom is therefore a habit that has been widely adopted by a group of people. So a custom is a collection of customs makes up a material culture. For example, jeans. Jeans are part of culture. Culture is not prevalent throughout the entire world, but it does exist throughout the entire world. An adopted collection of social customs produces the group's material culture, so jeans and young people wearing jeans. So when we look at this stuff, custom may be used to denote a specific element of material culture, such as a group wearing jeans, whereas culture overall refers to a group's entire collection of customs. So jeans would just be one custom within the actual culture. Also, when looking at culture, we need to make the distinction between what we call folk culture and popular culture. Folk culture is not just the Amish, but the Amish are a good example of folk culture because material culture can be broken into two basic categories, and one of those is folk culture. Folk culture is traditionally practiced primarily by a small, homogeneous group living in isolated areas. An example here could be the Amish. The Amish are mostly prevalent in the Midwestern United States and the Eastern United States, with the heaviest concentrations being in northern Wisconsin, eastern Ohio, and northern Pennsylvania. But they do exist throughout the entire country, although in very small pockets. Parts of folk culture, there are several components of folk culture. This is a Peruvian woman in traditional Peruvian dress, which is part of their folk culture because there's a small group of people living in an isolated rural area that practices that. Every country that you'll be studying has some type of folk culture. Components of folk culture include folk music. So folk music is traditionally anonymous and transmitted orally. You don't know who wrote it, but you learn how to sing the song. So an example of American folk culture, even though, yes, we know the author, could be the Star-Spangled Banner because it is transmitted orally and it's part of our cultural heritage as Americans. Folk sports are also an important part of culture. Hockey started as a folk sport in the northern United States, Canada, and Europe, and although it has diffused, its hearth exists in a folk culture because it is a small group of isolated people that first practiced the sport. There are lots of other examples of folk sports. Cricket is one in the United Kingdom. Baseball was once considered a folk sport, and even lacrosse was once considered a folk sport. So they're sports and components of culture that have very specific origins and very small, isolated pockets. Folk housing could also be considered an example of a folk component. Folk housing could be anything from a split level in the Midwest to a ranch style out in California to the French style in France, etc. Folk food, obviously, most of you are probably familiar with some kind of cultural heritage. You probably have a family tradition of food that you eat. Folk clothing is also an example. This woman is wearing a traditional Peruvian dress, very colorful, the wide-brimmed hat, etc., and carrying her child in traditional folk tradition. But every culture has their own clothing traditions. Indian women wear saris, which are wrapped cloth. American teenage culture is to wear jeans, whereas Amish culture would be to wear, very plain, simple clothing, etc. So within folk culture, there's all these different aspects, and folk culture is a part of material culture. So as Americans and American students, you're much more familiar with what we call popular culture. Popular culture is found in large, heterogeneous, so there's lots of different people. It's found in societies that share common customs, like wearing jeans could be one, despite differences in their personal characteristics. So there's lots of different things that go into that. In contrast to folk customs, popular culture is often a product of developed regions. So usually, only highly developed regions have popular cultures, especially in North America and Europe. Popular music and fast food are good examples of pop culture. They arise from a combination of advances in industrial technology and increased leisure time. Popular culture is based on a rapid, simultaneous global connections through communication systems, transportation networks, and other modern technology. Rapid diffusion of popular culture facilitates frequent changes in popular customs. What was cool in 7th grade might not be cool now. Thus, folk culture is more likely to vary from place to place at any given time, whereas popular culture is more likely to vary from time to time at any given place. So examples of popular culture include music, of course, include food, include clothing, sports, etc. So what is popular, whether it's pizza or t-shirts or the most popular music happening right now, whatever it may be, that's all components of popular culture. Many of these objects produced in popular culture are mass-produced, and they help people enjoy leisure time, which has increased as a result of widespread change in the labor force from primary to more tertiary jobs, leading to development. So all these things are connected together. Generally, countries gain popular culture as they gain development. Housing is also an example of popular culture. So, the trendiness in whatever house you live in, whether it's a loft or an apartment, whatever is cool, quote unquote, in the region that you live in. Aside from folk culture and popular culture, within material culture, we also see religion and language being a part of culture. Just because someone practices one culture, speaks one language, and practices one religion, doesn't mean that's the same for everybody who practices the same religion or is within the same culture, etc. So if we look at language, language is basically a system of communication through speech. It's a collection of sounds that a group of people understands to have the same meaning. An official language is one that is used by a government for conducting business and publishing documents. In the United States, we do not have a traditional language. But every language in the world comes from some kind of other language. This is a map showing the Indo-European branches of the language, and so there's many different trees of language, but we see this is, the base tree, and then there's all these different little pieces. English mainly comes from the Romance languages because English, Italian, French, Spanish, etc. have many words in common. But then there's the Germanic language branches, the Slavonic, the Iranian, the Indic, the Greek, the Anatolian, etc. And so all these have different little pieces off of them. So as you can see, the English language is over here, and it comes off of the fact that it is part of this branch of Celtic traditional languages. So language is a part of culture, whether it's the family, the branch, or the group, or native speakers of that language. All languages somehow share some kind of interconnectedness. And if we look at religion, religion is of course broken up into lots of different religions, and this is just a very basic graph showing world religions by percentage. Of course, within Christianity, we have Catholics, we have Baptists, we have Mormons, etc. There's all different groups within Christians, within Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, etc., the other categories. So language and religion are important parts of culture, which we will get to more in depth later in this unit. Another important part of culture is race and ethnicity. We have to make the distinction between these two categories. Ethnicity is the identity with a group of people who share the cultural traditions of a particular homeland or a particular hearth. For instance, African Americans. People who are of African American descent would consider themselves American as they were probably born here. However, they do have African heritage. They might have African cultural traditions, and they do share a particular homeland, which would be Africa. So someone's ethnicity could be African American. However, they might not identify that with their race necessarily. Race, on the other hand, is identity with a group of people who share a biological ancestor. So here, if you just say someone is black, because they have darker skin, that person might identify as coming from Africa, or coming from parts of Asia, or coming from parts of Latin America. So we have to make those distinctions when understanding the difference between race and ethnicity. Overall, we just have to make these distinctions that ethnicity and race are not necessarily the same thing, because every culture is unique. When we look at culture, the culture of the Midwest might be very different from the culture of the South, or the West, or the Northeast, if speaking just to the United States. Every culture has what we call a norm. So norms are sets of agreed upon expectations for a culture. For example, in America, we see that looking one another in the eye when we're talking is a sign of respect, and averting your eyes is seen as disrespectful or somewhat awkward, etc. Whereas the Japanese culture encourages people to avert their eyes as a show of politeness and respect. Furthermore, in Japanese culture, they bow as a sign of respect. How far you bow down is based on the respect that you're showing to the person that you are bowing to. So instead of shaking hands, their culture bows, whereas our culture shakes hands. So every culture is unique, and there's lots of different aspects that go into culture, and that's really what we'll be looking at in Unit 4, is understanding the aspects of culture and what makes every culture unique.